Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. My guest is a faithful member of Aware's monthly anti-war demonstrations in downtown Champaign, but he's here to talk about Urbana and its voting system. James Manrique. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, August 7th in the studios of Urbana Public Television. So, James, why don't you lead off and
definitely.
tell us about voting?
Yeah, definitely. I've been working with another colleague in town, Ben Chapman. He started a group called Illinoisans for Ranked Choice Voting. We're trying to bring awareness statewide for alternate voting methods, especially ranked choice voting. Because we think that would be an excellent alternative to the methods that we currently have. It's called first past the poll. Currently, a candidate can win without the majority of the votes. He can get less than 50% of the votes and still win the election. We think that candidates should get at least 50% of the votes to be our elected official. We think that would be a more fair representation of the democracy. And one way to achieve that is through ranked choice voting. Some other countries have already done it, such as Australia, and Ireland has done it very successfully for nearly 100 years. It's just a very simple thing of ranking your politicians 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with 1 being your most highly rated choice, and then going down the list from there.
I didn't realize that it was, I'd heard of Australia, but Ireland's been doing it for a long time?
Yeah, I actually did a little bit of research before the show today, and it appears that Ireland's actually been doing it for nearly 100 years.
Good heavens.
And they just do there are some more complicated ways to do ranked choice voting, where it's like sometimes your vote goes to the party instead of like other candidates. But Ireland just does the simple, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Interesting.
And it's been working for them. They recently just passed so that they can do it on referendums too. So instead of having a binary yes/no option on the referendum, now you can have like 3 or 4 different choices and be like, well, if this choice doesn't go through, here's my second and third option.
Interesting. I had no idea the Irish were so advanced.
Neither did I. I'm always fascinated to learn about other countries and other states around the world that have seemed to do a little bit better with their voting systems. Oregon's another example of a state with interesting voting.
Oh, yes.
I think there might be a part of Oregon that has done ranked choice voting, but Oregon also has vote by mail, which has turned out to have an enormous effect on voter turnout. Me and Ben Chapman and a few other people are working on bringing greater awareness statewide for it. And then we're also working locally here in Urbana to try to restart, or try to get something passed in Urbana, because Urbana is really kind of like a good place to try new democratic ideas, because Urbana tends to be more in favor of that sort of thing. There was actually an effort about 10 years ago to get ranked choice voting in Urbana, and unfortunately it failed by just a handful of votes. They got signatures on the ballot, or signatures on the petition, rather, sorry.
I was living in Champaign at the time, and I think we ignored it entirely.
Yeah, but they worked to get a whole bunch of signatures, and they accidentally got the number wrong, so they came up short. The political parties that be at the time did everything that they could to stop it from getting on the ballot. Apparently, they were a little bit afraid of that sort of system. Having somebody win with a majority instead of a minority. So we've been talking with a lot of different people locally. We talked to Durrell Cruz. He led it 10 years ago in Urbana. Talked to him about his opinions on restarting it in town. Just yesterday we talked with Eric Jacobson. He seems like he's in support of it. So it really seems like we have some different paths to go in Urbana. And then also for the statewide movement, we're going to be holding a rally or a protest for J.B. Pritzker. He's going to be in town next Wednesday, and we want J.B. Pritzker to make a statement or ideally endorse ranked choice voting as another voting method for Illinoisans. So far, J.B. Pritzker hasn't really responded to our questions. So we hope that this rally next Wednesday, when he's in town, I think that it's around noon to 1, there's information on Facebook about it. But we hope that this rally will get him to make a statement on ranked choice voting.
Where and when is the rally?
The information is on Facebook. I could not tell you the exact place, but it is.
I will put that on the Facebook page for Where on the Air, too.
But it is next Wednesday, and it's around like noon to 1, somewhere in that time frame. So yeah, hopefully we can get Pritzker to make a statement on that, because then that would bring a ton of awareness statewide to that sort of movement. What else is there to say on ranked choice voting? Like I said, it's we had there's many elections that are examples that are where ranked choice voting would make it better. For example, in Urbana, there's been several times where there have been multiple people running for mayor, more than 2 people, and then you get the situation where ranked choice voting can help that. And then statewide, the Attorney General's race this last primary, there were 8 people running for Attorney General on the Democratic ticket. So the person that won ended up with only like 25 or 30% of the vote. And then J.B. Pritzker, there was 5 people running for governor on the Democratic ticket, and J.B. Pritzker ended up winning with around 40% of the vote. So it's just interesting that these candidates can win while 60% of the people say that they want somebody else. It's a very interesting situation. So we're working to try to change that, or try to introduce a new system to help improve that.
What happens in the example you gave? For example, the Democratic primary with Pritzker and 5 others, was it, or 5?
Yeah, 5 total. Yeah,
5 total. If ranked choice voting, as I understand it, means that you're given a ballot with a number of candidates' names, and you simply indicate your first choice, your second choice, your third, so forth down the list, and then these choices are tabulated in a way that allows perhaps the candidate who got less than a candidate who didn't get most of the vote, who didn't get the largest number of votes, in fact, to be selected on the basis of votes down the ticket, or down the way. What do you say to Mr. Pritzker, who says, wait a minute, I got most votes, I got 20% of the votes here, and you're saying that someone else with fewer votes is elected because of the second and third place choices? How do you answer that?
Well, it goes back to that there was 60% of the people that said that they didn't want him as their first choice. So with the ranked choice voting, you get more of like candidates in the middle, because you get people that are more agreeable. So like with ranked choice voting, if no candidate gets 50%, then the lowest candidate drops off and their votes go to the next person. So it really
privilege their votes in some way, then? I mean, they get to vote for 2 people, the person they picked and the person they picked second?
Oh, so does everybody, but I don't know. It's there are flaws with every voting system, and I mean, the advantage with ranked choice voting is that the minorities have a stronger chance, or minority opinions have a stronger chance of being represented in a ranked choice voting system. Whereas the current system that we have really, really encourages just the 2-party mantra, and your vote is absolutely wasted if you try to go third party. So at least with ranked choice voting, no one vote is discredited, and the goal is to try to get one candidate that at least has the majority of people somewhat supporting them, rather than,
Take the gubernatorial race here in Illinois, since you mentioned Pritzker already. The incumbent, Mr. Honor, and Pritzker apparently have a third candidate, I understand.
Even a fourth.
Even a fourth.
Yeah, there's 4 people running for governor right now. So, again, ranked choice voting would help that situation. It might help Ronner. I don't know. It's hard to say, really, because the other 2 candidates are Cash Jackson with the Libertarian Party, and McCann, or is it McCann, I think? Sam McCann with the Conservative Party. So Sam McCann's really trying to siphon off votes from Ronner. Cash Jackson's kind of trying to siphon off votes from both of them. And then that's where you get like the spoiler situation, where these third-party candidates can make it so that, they can sort of spoil an election. So ranked choice voting helps with that as well.
So ranked choice voting would finally tend to not discourage, but at least not countenance quite so much spoiler candidates. In other words, people who say, oh, he's getting in this race to draw votes away from so-and-so.
Yeah, exactly.
And in ranked choice voting, that wouldn't matter? Or that
Exactly.
would matter less?
Yeah, exactly. And then with ranked choice voting, it helps encourage building coalitions because, if one candidate's like, vote for me and or, make the second choice this other party that has, 80% of what we support. So it helps generally have politicians talk more to the middle instead of the extremes of the population.
What are its chances of being adopted in Urbana?
I think Urbana has a decent chance because, like I said, Urbana tends to be a place where sometimes they try new ideas. And there has been instances in the past when there's been more than 2 candidates on the ballot in Urbana for either like a city council district or for the mayor race. So there are reasons to have it in Urbana. And I think if nothing else that getting an advisory ballot referendum should be totally feasible because you can get an advisory referendum for just about anything and then that can just, if nothing else, bring awareness to the people of Urbana. And if there was overwhelming support for it, that could help encourage any of the city council members to move forward to try to implement it.
Now, the actual history of advisory ballot, advisory recommendations on the ballot is not a very happy one recently. Wasn't it the case? Going back even to the beginning of the Iraq War, I remember there were anti-war resolutions and so forth on the ballot in Champaign and Urbana too, I think, that did very well. And that so upset the political establishment that they quickly passed a law to remove most of these advisory referenda. It's a more complicated, convoluted, and difficult process to get an advisory referendum, that is something that tells the government what to do, on the ballot. Ranked choice voting seems to fly in the face of that. That is, if you say it's useful for advisory referenda, it's helpful, I would think, to have advisory referenda.
Absolutely.
Apparently we don't.
I think it's still somewhat easy to get things on as a advisory referendum because, like, even in 2014, there was one statewide for whether or not we should tax millionaires, and obviously,
Yes,
overwhelmingly,
that's right.
people said yes on it, and then our politicians didn't do a lot with it. So,
And it disappeared like the snows of yesteryear after the election.
Exactly. But at least it brings awareness, and at least it gives activists a solid point of reference to say, look, the constituents want this, and you should do what the constituents want.
Because certainly it's our experience that particularly in major races for elected office, Republicans and Democrats usually want to obfuscate the differences between them with 1 or 2 popular exceptions, and not really talk too much about what their policies in office would be.
Oh, yes.
if it differentiates them much from their opponent, for fear of missing those voters who disagree with them. So it's an interesting idea, I must say, and the experience of other times and places with it suggests that it would be a worthwhile change. I think most people right now, as they approach the voting booth, have the idea that, well, they'll vote for somebody whom they like, but it won't have too much difference. It won't make too much difference. That an awful lot of people who stay away from the polls say either there's nothing to choose, they're basically the same, or it won't make any difference anyhow because the way the election system is set up, the outcome is predetermined as it stands. Maybe this will shake that, maybe this would shake this up.
Yeah, hopefully, because it should encourage more, like I said, minority opinions to come to the ticket to try to express their views and get votes. And I think like the majority of people tend to want to vote. There is a good chunk of people, like maybe 20-25% of people that just don't want to vote. They think the system's rigged.
Right.
But I think there are people.
Right.
Well, to a certain degree, absolutely. But there are people that really want to encourage the change and want to participate. So I think just giving them, making their voice so that instead of, a candidate winning with 40%, you can get somebody that wins with, the majority of the support. But yeah, I mean, there are flaws with every type of system, but.
What's the process of getting such a system adopted? How would that happen?
There's a couple different ways. For the city council stuff, it's a little bit easier because I think those elections are ran just on the county level, as opposed to the state. But if you were doing it on the state level, it would probably have to go through the Board of Elections.
So that's why you work, as it were, from the bottom up. You say, let's do this for the Urbana City Council or for the county board. Right?
And then that also gives real world examples of look, you can work here. It's not so hard. It's not so scary. I mean, that's one of the things is they try to make it seem like it's overly complicated. And there are some other alternative voting methods, like proportional votes, where you can you have 100% of your vote. You can give 80% to one candidate and 20% to another. And those are probably better than what we have now, but I would say that those are also a lot more complicated than the ranked choice voting, because everybody understands, a top 5 list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That makes sense. But then, trying to split it up harder, that gets a bit more complicated.
The culture being what it is, our tradition of voting and so forth, unlike the Irish, as you point out, most Americans, I think, would need some explanation of how the system would work and how to do it. Even the name, I mean, although it's perfectly liberal, it's perfectly literal.
Yeah.
I really meant to say literal. It's perfectly literal to speak of ranked choice voting. The phrase doesn't immediately ring in the ear, you don't say, oh yes, I understand that, that's a lovely idea, etc.
Some people
I'm not sure what a better phrase would be, a better name would be.
Some people shorten it. Some people shorten it just to choice voting, just to make it even shorter and easier.
Which has become so short that it's absolutely ambiguous.
Yeah, exactly. But just I guess the idea is just to advocate for an alternative system to what we have now, because what we have now seems to encourage just these two parties, and it seems to be almost impossible for a third party to break out of that system.
That's true. That's true. And the laws regarding voting are not much of a help here. I mean, they're meant to obfuscate this, because obfuscation makes it easier to control the system as a whole.
Oh, absolutely.
I had the mixed pleasure, it was a pleasure in some ways, the mixed pleasure, many, many years ago of running for Congress in this district as a Green Party candidate. And the Green Party had come into the system, and it wasn't clear who we offended more, the Republicans or the Democrats, even though this was supposedly a safe Democratic congressional seat. The Democrats, sorry, I said that backwards. This was a safe Republican congressional seat. The Democrats were not even going to run a candidate against the then incumbent. This was long, long ago, back before you were born. And it was only when we, the Green Party, got in as a result of a massive signature campaign that the Democrats said, "Oh my goodness, we're going to, the Greens actually might win this sort of thing. We can't have that." And therefore, they put up a Democratic candidate who took all the usual regular Democratic votes, and the Republican was elected, as everyone expected. So the status quo anti was established. But I came away thinking that what one needed to do in a state like Illinois was elect members of Congress at large and by party, so that when you went to vote for Congress in the fall, you wouldn't vote for in a single member district. You would vote for the Republicans, the Democrats, the Greens, the Libertarians, the Conservatives, who else you might have. You would vote by party, and each party would receive the number of seats in Congress equal to its proportion of the vote. So if the Democrats got half the vote, they get half the Illinois seats. In those days, there were 20 Illinois congressional seats. So Democrats got to have it. 10 guys in a list pre-established by the Democrats, the top 10, they go to Washington. If the Republicans get 30% of the vote, they send 3 guys to Washington. If the Greens and Libertarians each get 1, they send 1 guy.
I like those systems too, because again, it gives the minority opinions better representation instead of having no representation and the establishment candidate just getting the entirety of the vote or whatever portion. You at least get that little bit of voice in the House of Representatives.
And it defeats the gerrymandering that says the careful drawing of districts that a party in control does to make sure that it maximizes the number of seats it holds.
Yes.
But I don't expect to see. I expect to see your system adopted before mine is. So it's.
I mean, either one would be. I would be in favor of either one. And speaking of our congressional district, even this last primary, there was 4 or 5 candidates running in that congressional district.
On the Democratic side, yes.
Yeah, and so that vote again was split, and I'm not 100% sure, but I think the person that won didn't have the full 50. But.
Oh no, I think that's right. It would be a victory even to get people thinking and talking about how they want to be represented.
Exactly, because that is something that we've run into, or Ben Chapman has run into, talking to various representatives in our district or locally about ranked choice voting, is that some of these representatives aren't even aware of other options or other voting systems. And not to their fault or anything, just there isn't a lot of education about it. Like you say, the political parties that don't necessarily want to educate the public about the alternate voting options because it might, dethrone some of their power. But that's a lot of what we're doing with the group, is just trying to bring general awareness that there are alternatives to the current voting system. And, wouldn't it be interesting if we tried something like that in Illinois or in Urbana?
It would indeed. You're watching Aware on the Air. We've been talking to James Manrique about the voting systems around here, and particularly about his proposal of his from him and his associates for ranked choice voting in Urbana. We'll put some links to this discussion on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, and recommend you take a note of it.
Yeah, definitely. If you want to find more information, there's a Facebook group, Illinoisans for Ranked Choice Voting. And like Carl said, there will be links on the Aware page for the upcoming event next Wednesday, and where to find the other Facebook page. So thank you.
Thank you, James. Appreciate your coming in and telling us about this. This is Aware on the Air. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world. A subject that voters in America are finally responsible for, and one we should pay perhaps a good deal more attention to than we do. We also concern ourselves with the racism we display to those we're killing around the world, in accord with the Latin proverb "Proprium omni ingeni est odissi cum laesuris." It's human nature to hate those you have injured. While President Trump is talking peace with the leaders of Russia, North Korea, and even Iran, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, though most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, an international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is talk about the unmentionable, U.S. government killing around the world, and encourage our fellow citizens to oppose it. We heard this week that U.S. drone warfare in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia has killed up more than 1,500 civilians and amount to almost 5,000 drone strikes, drone assassinations. But keep in mind that that war, that drone war, which has been going on throughout the Obama administration and into the Trump administration, is still a secret. The U.S. doesn't keep records of its assassinations, and the U.S. has no real idea whom they're killing because the assassinations are hardly pinpoint. It's not clear whether it's the target that's aimed at or passerbys who are killed, and what studies there are suggest that the ratio is at least 10 to 1 of passersby to the designated target of the drone strikes. Each missile creates so much damage and vaporizes, these are American missiles, of course, being shot in countries around the world. Each missile creates so much damage and vaporizes so many people, we just don't know the truth about the scope of the assassinations the U.S. is responsible for in the drone war. But we do know that this continues escalating across U.S. administrations, and the victims include Americans and children. All are killed extrajudicially. No charges, no evidence, no trial, and no chance for defense or rebuttal. Afghanistan, of course, is one of the scenes of American drone assassinations, and the war, which will enter its 18th year this fall, includes the observation of the current American commander of the war that the situation in Afghanistan is not getting better, it's getting worse. So the war, both the drone war and the war on the ground, continues, and that war goes on while we argue about whether the Russians said nasty things during the last election. There are a number of other things immediately on the agenda at the moment, including the deteriorating relations with Iran, the interesting and perhaps quite deadly contradictions within the Trump administration on Iran should be noted, and not much has been said about it. The fact is that the president has said that he's willing to talk to the leaders of Iran, even though he has withdrawn apparently from the the arrangement with Iran, the nuclear deal. But then his Secretary of State, the Mad Mike Pompeo, immediately comes out and says, well, what the president said is not quite right. There are some preconditions on our talking to Iran. So when we have contradictions like this among the spokespeople for American policy, it's a little difficult to understand who's running American policy, but the direction of that policy, the nature of that policy, that's not a problem at all. We continue to kill people at great numbers in Afghanistan. It has been suggested that the Iranian situation is particularly dangerous because the preparation, if that's what it is, for war with Iran resembles nothing so much as the preparation for war with Japan before 1941. The Roosevelt administration did the same thing with Iran that the U.S. is now the Roosevelt administration did the same thing with Japan that the U.S. is now doing with Iran. In those days, long ago, Washington laid out terms of surrender for Japan in their conquest, in their contest for control of the Asia Pacific, and then cut off Japan's oil, cut off Japan's access to oil. No nation in the world would have accepted such a humiliation in 1941. The U.S. wanted war then, and urged by the cutoff of oil, Japan to strike first, which they did at Pearl Harbor. The question is whether this tradition, which might be paralleled with American policies at other times and places too, including Fort Sumter, the question is the U.S. doing that right now with Iran, with its sanctions, its attempt to cut off Iran's oil trade? Iran, of course, is a major supplier of oil. Whether it will be able to do this or not is certainly not clear, but the direction in which the U.S. is going, at the very least, gives one pause. The Second World War parallels may come to mind, particularly this week, because we are today between the anniversaries of the atomic bomb attack on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the atomic attack on Nagasaki, August 9th, 1945. The old American explanations for these great crimes don't wash anymore. The U.S. was doing two things in killing hundreds of thousands of people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was testing new and untried weapons, and it was moving to intimidate the Soviet Union. Remember that Soviet Union had just joined the war against Japan, and the U.S. in 1945 wanted to make sure that the outcome of the Second World War would be American hegemony over the Asia-Pacific region, and no Russians need apply. To keep Russia out of the Asia-Pacific region was a paramount concern for the demonstration bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Americans should recall that our country was responsible for two of the great crimes of the century, comparable only perhaps to the German attacks on Jews in Romany and others, and the massacres of the century, which reach a peak, unfortunately, in what our country did on August 6, 1945, and August 9th. You're listening to Watching Aware on the Air. We will turn to some points raised by our researcher, Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, talking about some of the war issues that confront us today. The case of Julian Assange is one that is unfortunately not as well known as it should be in this country, given what looks like the United States is doing at the moment. Julian Assange was the head of the WikiLeaks group, and he's been in what is essentially an incommunicado prison in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. His health is poor. He has no real contact with the outside world, and Ecuador, which granted him asylum in the first place because of American threats to prosecute him for publication of American war secrets. Ecuador has now pulled his internet feed months ago, and his permission to continue to live in the embassy is precarious, as said to be ending soon. There's a change in government in Ecuador, and the new government in Ecuador is not willing to maintain the asylum that was offered by the previous government. Mainstream media in this country is tellingly silent about this. Most people don't even know who Julian Assange is, as any threat to him also endangers their ability to report news. So obviously they don't want to mention that. We want him to be free, happy, and healthy. We need him and WikiLeaks.org. We can't afford to lose truth tellers. So the case of Julian Assange is one that we should be talking about a good deal more. There is a online vigil for Julian Assange, organized, you can find that online by looking for it with the regular search engines. The online vigil has input from many other people in this country, some of whom you may have heard of: Caitlin Johnstone, Kim Dotcom, Cynthia McKinney, Ray McGovern, and many others. And it's this attempt to make an end run around mainstream media's ignoring the plight of Julian Assange. The only comedy news show worth watching, RT's Redacted Tonight, puts some stories in perspective and does indeed report on Assange. RT's Redacted Tonight also brought us the story of TSA, the airport supposed safety organization, Quiet Skies program. This is a program of those guys who violate your privacy when you try to get on an airplane. That's a program they're running that specifically targets travelers who are not under investigation by any agency and are not in the terrorist screening database, according to the revelation about this program that came from the Boston Globe this last week. In a request from Congress, the TSA reported that the agency, which spent $800 million in 2015 on this program of following people about whom they have no information, has no information on its effectiveness in deterring attacks. According to what the government says are its standards, or the purpose for the TSA, there is no cause to be conducting these secret missions. You're watching Aware on the Air. I want to turn to a comment by one of the people in the American media who is actually reporting what the U.S. is doing. This is Nick Turse, who has for a while been talking about American military operations, particularly in Africa. His material appears in a blog and a column called Tom Dispatch, run by Tom Engelhardt. And Engelhardt had a comment about this most recent observation by Nick Turse. He says, "It looks like Tom Dispatch, his blog, may have a few less readers from now on. Perhaps it will surprise you, but judging by the mail I get, some members of the U.S. military do read Tom Dispatch, partially to check out the range of military and ex-military critics of America's war that this site publishes. Or rather, they did read Tom Dispatch. No longer, it seems, if their computers are operating via the Department of Defense networks. The Department of Defense, I've heard, has blocked the site. You now get this message, I'm told, when you try to go to it. Quote, you have attempted to access a blocked website. Access to this website has been blocked for operational reasons by the Department of Defense Enterprise Level Protection System." That's all in caps. That's what the Department of Defense says they are and what they're doing. The Department of Defense Enterprise Level Protection System. As I translate that from the American, enterprise level means the wars we're fighting. The Department of Defense Enterprise Level Protection System. Protection system means keeping them quiet. So the whole point of the operation is that people don't know about the wars being conducted by the United States around the world. And the category that accounts for its being blocked? Hate and racism. We know what the Defense Department is defending us from: haters and racists. What they're actually doing is making sure you don't know about the wars the Department of Defense is fighting. Mind you, you can evidently still read both Breitbart and InfoWars in a beautifully unblocked state via the same networks, and there are some people who suggest they include some hate and some racism too. So it's a wonderfully propagandistic account about why you cannot get this sort of information if you happen to be a member of the military and using the Department of Defense as your source. On consideration, however, I've concluded the Department of Defense might have a point. Since this site was launched, we're talking about this blog, Tom Dispatch. Since the site was launched as a no-name listserv in October 2001, soon after the Afghan war started, you know, the war that the Department of Defense is still pursuing so successfully almost 17 years later. I think we were supposed to hear some irony in that line. With its 17th commander now in the field, they don't exactly do one per year, but that's what it's worked out to. Its 17th commander now in the field, 15,000 American troops still fighting and advising there, and still dying there as well. That's Afghanistan. And the enemy, the Taliban in particular, in control of yet more territory in that country than it was last year. We might also mention that the war also includes our NATO allies, which is the unstated issue in some ways with the attempt of the Trump administration to screw a little more money out of NATO to pay for the wars that the U.S. is conducting in Afghanistan, and that these NATO mercenaries, which is basically what they are fighting. Tom Dispatch has always hated America's never-ending, ever-spreading, refugee and terror-producing wars that now extend from South Asia across the Middle East and deep into Africa. So perhaps this site is, after all, a must-block hate site, as the Defense Department says. What the hate is, of course, is hatred for the vastly illegal wars being conducted by the U.S. government and the Department of Defense. And among the authors who have spread Tom Dispatch's anti-war gospel of hatred, now so judiciously cut off by the Pentagon, Nick Turse, in particular, has long grimly tracked the growth and spread of Washington's forever wars and of the Special Operations Forces, the semi-secret military that has become in these years their heart and soul. He returns to this sorry tale again today, this time in a unique fashion, by tracing the careers of those in the military, commanders and commanded, dead and alive, who returned to America's official and unofficial war zones again and again and yet again. Maybe someone should suggest to the Pentagon that there's something else out there to block, so that another website 17 years from now won't be writing about about Washington's 34th commander in the field in Afghanistan. Maybe it's time to block those wars. This is Nick Turse's account of special operations being these American expeditionary forces around the world. The Special Operations Command, 17,000 American soldiers of various sorts operating in 3/4 of the countries of the world. How many Americans have any idea that such a thing is going on? Special Operations, Generational Struggle, and the Cooperstown of Commandos is the title of Turse's article. Raids by U.S. commandos in Afghanistan. I could be talking about 2001 or 2018. A U.S. drone strike in Yemen. I could be talking about 2002 or 2018. Missions by Green Berets in Iraq. I could be talking about 2003 or 2018. While so much about the war on terror, turned global war on terrorism, turned World War IV, turned the Long War, turned generational struggle, turned infinite war, seems repetitious, the troops most associated with this conflict, the U.S. Special Operations Forces, have seen changes galore. As Representative Jim Saxton, Republican of New Jersey, chairman of the Terrorism, Unconventional Threats, and Capabilities Subcommittee, how would you like that on your nameplate, pointed out in 2006, referring to Special Operations Command by its acronym, for almost 5 years now, quote, for almost 5 years now, SOCOM, Special Operations, has been leading the way in the war on terrorism, defeating the Taliban, and eliminating a terrorist safe haven in Afghanistan, really, removing a truly vicious Iraqi dictator, right, and combating the terrorists who seek to destabilize the new democratic Iraq, close quote. Much has changed since Saxton looked back on SOCOM's role in the early years of the war on terrorism. For starters, Saxton retired almost a decade ago But the Taliban, despite being defeated way back then, according to him, didn't do the same. Today they contest for or control about 44% of Afghanistan. Even the U.S. admits that. That country also hosts many more terror groups, 20 in all, than it did 12 years ago. Vicious Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein is, of course, still dead and gone, but in 2014 about a third of the, quote, new democratic Iraq was overrun by Islamic State militants. The country was only reliberated in late 2017, and the Islamic State is already making a comeback there this year. Meanwhile, Iraq is beset by anti-government protests and totters along as one of the most fragile states on the planet, while the Iraqi and Afghan war zones bled together, with U.S. special operators now fighting an Islamic State terrorist franchise in Afghanistan, too. In spite, or perhaps because of these circumstances, SOCOM, Special Operations, continues to thrive. Its budget, its personnel numbers, and just about any other measure you might choose, from missions to global reach, continue to rise. You have to understand what he's talking about here is a private army, not subject to any congressional oversight, that the United States uses around the world to fight some of the 8 wars, to fight in the 8 wars that the U.S. continues to conduct in the last administration and this one. In 2006, for example, 85% of Special Operation Forces deployed overseas, Army Green Berets, Rangers, Navy SEALs, and others, were concentrated in the greater Middle East, with far smaller numbers spread thinly across the Pacific, 7%, Europe, 3%, and Latin America, 3%. Only 1% of them were then conducting missions in Africa. Today, the lion's share, 56% of those commandos, still operate in the greater Mideast, according to figures provided by SOCOM itself, but all other foreign deployments have grown at that region's expense. Africa Command has leapt from last to second place and now hosts 16.5% of America's overseas commandos. European Command, 14% of these U.S. Commandos. The newly renamed Indo-Pacific Command, 8.6%, and Southern Command, 4.5%. Southern Command is primarily Latin America. As deployments have shifted geographically, the number of special operators, it's a euphemism for Americans killing people around the world, the number of special operators overseas has risen dramatically. In any given week in 2001, an average of 2,900 commandos were deployed abroad. By 2014, that number had hit 7,200. Today, according to SOCOM, it's 8,300. The number has grown throughout the period. A generation of commandos have spent their careers fighting on the proliferating fronts of Washington's forever wars, hopping from one conflict zone to another, or sometimes returning to the same campaign again and again. Some have spent much of their adult lives at war, and a number have lost their lives after multiple war zone tours, still without a victory at sight. Quote, at this stage in the ongoing counter-violent extremist type of fight, that's the way they talk at the Pentagon, it is not a rare exception for airmen to be on their 12th, 13th, or 14th deployment. Lieutenant General Marshall Webb, the Chief of Air Force Special Operations Command, told the Senate Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities earlier this year. And when it comes to serial deployments, Special Ops airmen are hardly unique. Consider, for example, Green Beret Colonel Owen Ray, who recently took command of the 1st Special Forces Group. His path to that post might be thought of as the military equivalent of working his way up from the mailroom. He has, in fact, held a command at every level of the 1st SFG, Special Forces Group. In 2003, he served as a detachment commander in Afghanistan. By 2011, he was back there as a company commander. In 2013, he returned as chief of the 1st Special Forces Group, 4th Battalion. Now he heads a unit whose members have spent the last years deploying to hot spots across the planet. Quote, I stand in absolute awe at the service rendered and the impact this unit had on multiple theaters, said outgoing Commander Colonel Guillaume Bropierre at a July change of command ceremony in which he handed over the reins to Ray. Beaupriere himself is a model of the long war SOF experience, so Special Forces experience, in multi-theater warfighting. A French immigrant commissioned as a U.S. officer in 1994, he served in South Korea, Kosovo, and sub-Saharan Africa. Many people were surprised to find American soldiers killed in Mali, not Mali, Namibia. Just recently, we had no idea, most Americans had no idea that there were soldiers at risk, American soldiers, fighting in these regions.
Isn't there also Nicaragua recently as well?
Pardon?
Nicaragua, I thought?
Well, that's a different situation, but that's true. I mean, the fact that the U.S. is boiling about in Nicaragua is a matter of very real concern. In 2007, the man he's writing of here, the French immigrant American soldier, commanded a Special Forces company in Iraq. In 2008, he was back in Iraq as the executive officer for a Special Operations Task Force in Baghdad. In 2010, he serves as the Deputy Chief of Staff of a Special Forces Joint Task Force and the Task Force Deputy Operations Officer during the lead-up to NATO's war in Libya. In 2011, he took command of a Special Forces battalion and supervised its operations in West Africa. He also played a role in establishing a Special Ops presence in Central Africa to aid local proxies fighting Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army. In 2012, he serves as the Chief of the Special Operations Command and Control Element in the Horn of Africa. Beaupriere is now assigned to Special Operations Command in Tampa, Florida, where he serves as Executive Officer to the Commander. A success story in American special operations. This spring, President Trump tapped Lieutenant General Scott Howell to be the first Air Force officer to head Joint Special Operations Command secretive hunter-killers, which include the Army's Delta Force and the Navy's SEAL Team 6. A longtime special operator, Hal has hopped back and forth between combat zones and stateside posts while steadily climbing the Special Ops ladder. His assignments have included a 2005-06 stint when he was still a lieutenant colonel as commander of the Joint Special Operations Aviation Detachment Arabian Peninsula at Joint Base Balad, Iraq. A 2008-10 assignment when he was a colonel as commander of the Joint Special Operations Aviation Component, Special Operations Task Force at Balad Air Base in Iraq and Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. A 2012-13 stint when he was a brigadier general as Deputy Commanding General of Special Operations Joint Task Force Afghanistan and NATO Special Operations Component Command Afghanistan, and then in 2016-17 position when he was a Major General as head of the NATO Special Operations Component Command Afghanistan and Special Operations Joint Task Force Afghanistan. The wearying list of titles nevertheless illustrates the extent to which the U.S. continues to carry on war around the world, using even immigrant officers, and most Americans haven't an idea that such a thing is going on. The real genius of the last administration, I think, was to cover sin with smooth names, as the scriptures say. In other words, most Americans were not aware that the man they elected as an anti-war candidate in 2008 would preside over continuous war-making throughout 2 presidential terms. That had never happened before. The U.S. had never had a president who had been at war through 2 consecutive terms. But Barack Obama was, and nobody really noticed. The genius of Barack Obama and the Democratic administration was to keep the entire thing on the down low as far as Americans are concerned. Maybe we should almost see it as a virtue that his predecessor, a master of bluster, is not so good at keeping these things hidden. There's a good deal more to be said about this. I will put this entire account of Special Operations Command on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, and some links to the stories that, once again, is not being told by mainstream media, and not by accident. It's a story that the American government wants to keep away from the only enemy that it really fears, that is the American public. And it's the American public that needs to know what's being done in our name, and the massive killing around the world that leads countries around the world to tell an international poll that they consider the United States by far the most dangerous country in the world. Not Iran, not Russia, not China, not even Israel, but the United States itself is the most dangerous in terms of its activity, particularly by the Special Operations Command. You've been watching Aware on the Air for Tuesday, August 7th, in the anniversary week of two of the greatest crimes of the 20th century, the atomic bombing of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States on August 6th and 9th, 1945. Only the German death camps for Jews, Gypsies, and other presumed enemies of Germany are in any way comparable to the mass murder of presumed enemies of the U.S. Japanese civilians. 73 years later, the U.S. government remains what Martin Luther King called it long ago, by far the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. We must stop it. Our program is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scholarly. Our thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. My thanks to my guest tonight, James Manrique, for a discussion of ranked choice voting. You can find links also to that matter on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, reminding you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. Good night.